Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in Cuba. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that Cuba is experiencing a deep economic crisis. Cuba is a net importer that relies upon the import of fuel and food, and as a result of the economic problems, both of those vital resources have been in short supply. And over the past 12 months or so, we have seen a huge increase in the number of people leaving Cuba. And of course, one of the other things that you'll be fully aware of if you follow the channel is that Russia has been facing a raft of sanctions since its invasion of Ukraine, and it's now having to find new markets for the export of its products. And in today's video, I want to provide you with the details of deals that have now been struck between Russia and Cuba with a view to revitalising their relationship. In the 1960s, 70s and 80s, the two countries were very close. However, following the breakup of the Soviet Union, that relationship fell apart. But Russia is now looking to build things back up again. So in today's video, we'll have a look at the deals that have been announced between Russia and Cuba. We'll also have a look at the ongoing fuel crisis, what's going on with regards to real estate in Cuba, some changes that have been made recently in terms of the migration policies. We'll have a look at what's been happening to the sugar industry recently, because Cuba used to be referred to as the sugar bowl of the world, but unfortunately it's lost that position. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen in Cuba over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. Since the start of the Ukraine war, the amount of trade between Russia and Cuba has increased significantly. Bilateral trade between the two countries reached $450 million in 2022, which was 3 times higher than the amount in 2021. And in the first 4 months of 2023, total trade was $138 million, which is 9 times higher than the corresponding period from 2022. Russia has now signalled its intent to further increase the levels of trade, and Russian officials and business leaders have signed multiple deals with Cuban counterparts at a forum held recently in Havana, agreeing to work together to boost sugar and rum output, assure the supply of wheat and crude oil to Cuba, and overhaul crumbling tourist facilities. The longtime political allies, both of which are now subject to US sanctions, are seeking to cement economic ties by facilitating trade and investment. In his closing speech at the forum, Ricardo Cabrizas, Cuba's foreign trade minister, stated these deals constitute a milestone in the history of our bilateral and business ties. The agreements include a contract for Russia to supply wheat to Cuba's state-owned Allen port, which is aimed at guaranteeing the stability of supply for the Cuban population. Another deal would create a Cuba-based marketplace for Russian goods, including food and home goods, called Rusmarket, which will also help spur development of more direct and fluid shipping routes between the two countries. A third deal states Russian and Cuban intention to revive the decrepit residential beach community of Tarara, whose white sand beaches just minutes from Havana, according to the documents, are ideal for enjoying the ocean, fishing and diving. The Russian Deputy Prime Minister for Tourism, Sport, Culture and Communications also announced a presidential order to reinstate by July 2023 regular flights between Russia and Cuba, which have been suspended since the start of the Ukraine conflict. Other agreements also announced included one aimed at developing a Russian-Cuban rum company, which would seek to boost exports of Cuba's prized rum, and Russia will also provide funds, know-how and technology to restart a steel mill in Cuba to supply construction materials on the island. So the commitments from Russia to increase the levels of trade with Cuba is obviously good news for Cuba. However, in return for this increased trade, Cuba have set new precedents to attract in those Russian investors. Individuals from Russia who invest in Cuba will be allowed to lease land for 30 years, an unprecedented step in the history of Cuba's communist government. Boris Titov, Russia's presidential commissioner for entrepreneurs' rights and chairman of the Russia-Cuban Business Council, recently announced that Cuban authorities are ready to provide special conditions for Russian businessmen, which include the right to make use of Cuban land for 30 years, duty-free importation of agricultural machinery, and the right to repatriate profits in foreign currency, which the Cuban government currently restricts. In a separate announcement, the Russian Deputy Prime Minister said that the Cuban government had also green-lighted Russian banks to open subsidiaries to finance Russian businesses on the island, and that the countries will transition to ruble-based investment in our joint projects. It was also announced that Russian state airline Aeroflot will resume regular flights to Cuba on July the 1st. This flurry of announcements is the clearest sign yet of the Cuban government's decision to move away from opening its economy to US investors in favour of its old political ally as the island seek a lifeline out of its economic crisis. The new arrangements with Russia are likely to add tension to Cuba's already strained relationship with the USA at a time when the Biden administration is moving to further expand sanctions against Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. Cuba's Minister of Foreign Commerce, Ricardo Cabrizas, said of the economic ties with Russia, "Nothing and no one can stop it," which contrasts entirely with the Cuban government's response to the Biden administration's authorization to a US company to offer a loan and invest in small private businesses in Cuba last year, which was the first time that such a move had been made for several decades. Officials from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have tried to assure potential US investors, in particular Cuban Americans, that they can do business on the island. However, the lack of Cuba's response to the US license and the increased ties with Russia signal that the hardliners are winning for now. And allowing Russian companies to lease land might be particularly controversial because American citizens and companies still hold certified property claims over land confiscated by Fidel Castro shortly after he took power in 1959. The Cuban government is the country's largest landowner after Castro ordered the confiscation of most land through a so-called agrarian reform. Excessive government control over lands, farming, food distribution and prices has caused agricultural production to plummet, and economists have advised the government to let more Cubans own or lease land for agriculture. For Russia, finding new markets for its products has become more crucial after its invasion of Ukraine led to financial and economic sanctions by the US and the European Union. Several officials have travelled recently to Cuba, which Putin sees as a key ally and is based around 90 miles away from the US shores. In response to these announcements, John Kavalich, president of the US-Cuba Trade and Economic Council, whose company received the US government license to invest in a private business in Cuba, stated that the concessions were not representative of a robust government-run economy and that it was almost a message of desperation. He went on to say that given Cuba's financial history, it is quite likely that the Russian experience may not be long-lived. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Guardio. When you browse online, a lot of your information is stored, including passwords, credit details, addresses, and a lot more. And all of that information needs to be protected. And Guardio provides real-time browsing protection that can detect threats before they cause harm and keep you and your information safe. Guardio is really quick and easy to install. And once it is installed, Guardio will work tirelessly in the background to save you from phishing sites, email scams, malicious extensions that could be altering your browser settings, and every other sort of scam that you can imagine. With Guardio installed, you'll know that you're safe when browsing online, you can shop securely, and there is no need to worry about visiting harmful websites. And the great news is that Joe Blogs viewers can get a 7-day free trial and 20% off a subscription, and one subscription will cover you and 4 other family members. So in order to take up this offer, please click in the description below. Russia has announced plans to revive Cuba's sugar industry, whose production has plunged to historic lows. Alexander Bogatyr of Russia's Progress Agro has announced that his firm and the Cuban state-run sugar company As Cuba would begin a joint venture as early as 2024 to overhaul the obsolete Uruguay sugar mill in Sancti Spiritus province in Cuba. The firm is aiming to eventually export as much as 150,000 tonnes of sugar per year, about 1/3 of this year's countrywide target. Cuba was once one of the top producers of sugar on the international market, and with this project working together, we hope to gradually lift levels of output, he said. This will be a significant investment because we will bring all of the new equipment and organise the supplies necessary to produce cane, such as fertiliser and specialised technology. So Russia is making a bold statement about the sugar industry in Cuba, and in order to understand how important this is to Cubans, let's have a look at the history of the sugar industry on the island. Cuba's climate is ideally suited to growing sugarcane, and the first recorded plantations date back to the early 16th century when it was under Spanish rule. And by 1860, Cuba produced over 30% of all of the world's sugar. The sugar industry continued to dominate the Cuban economy for the next 100 years, and still represented around 80% of all of Cuba's exports by the 1950s. However, by that stage, the economy was dominated by US and foreign investors, who owned around 75% of the arable land, 90% of the essential services, and around 40% of sugar production. However, when Fidel Castro overthrew the existing regime and took control in 1959, the capitalist system in Cuba was dissolved and replaced with a centrally planned economy which collectivized agricultural production. And over the course of the last 60 years, we have seen a progressive decline in the Cuban sugar industry. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 eliminated the main buyer and sent Cuba into a tailspin. After the global price of sugar fell throughout the 1990s, former Cuban President Fidel Castro announced in 2002 plans to close around half of the island's 156 sugar mills. Most were dismantled in the years that followed, slowly turning into ruins. And over the last 6 years alone, sugar production has fallen from more than 1.5 million tonnes a year to less than 500,000 tonnes, amid tougher sanctions on Cuba imposed by the administrations of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. The combination of the US sanctions and the COVID-19 pandemic has left Cuba's sugar industry on the verge of bankruptcy, with little money remaining for vital infrastructure inputs. Each year from November to May, it's time to cut the cane. However, Cuba is currently crippled by gasoline and diesel shortages, affecting both motorists and sugar workers who are supposed to be harvesting. And shortages of diesel for the harvesting machinery means that harvesting often stops for 1, 2, or even 3 days at a time. And even when the workers can harvest, they face fields that are now overgrown with weeds, which entangle and sometimes kill the cane, as the only way to successfully get rid of the weeds is to use expensive herbicide. 6 years ago, herbicide was applied to 1.5 million hectares of land. However, during the current harvest, only 100,000 hectares were sprayed, which represents a fall of almost 95%. Once the cane is cut from the fields, it's loaded onto rusty wagons and then onto a conveyor belt where it moves through a series of huge grinders. Some of the machinery dates back to the 19th century, and the key to a successful harvest is continuous grinding. And the sugar mills are designed to work 12 straight days before stopping for 12 hours of maintenance. However, during this harvesting season, the mills have been switched off for days on end due to lack of diesel and spare parts. The Cuban authorities' solution for the shortage of spare parts is to shut down more refineries so that those still running can cannibalise the motors, magnets and electrical breakers that still work. During last year's harvest, 36 refineries were in action. This year it's down to 23. And the bottom line issue for Cuba is that it's now producing a lot less sugar than it used to. Just over 60 years ago, before the US embargoes were put in place, Cuba was the world's largest exporter of sugar. In the 1980s, the island was producing more than 7 million tonnes per year. However, last year the yield was down to 480,000 tonnes, and this year the target is even lower as Cuba heads for its worst sugar harvest in more than a century. 60 years ago, sugar was a ubiquitous product in Cuba. However, today it is so strictly rationed that it's become a black market good, with grocers discreetly whispering the word to lucky passers-by. And 2023 will be the first year that Cuba doesn't export more sugar than it consumes. More than 300,000 Cubans arrived at the US border in 2022, according to US Customs and Border Patrol data, a record-breaking exodus amid an unprecedented economic crisis. The migration off the island has further stressed the country's already near-collapsed economy and weighs heavily on Cuban society, with many families broken and scattered across the globe. And in response to this, Cuba has now announced measures that ease restrictions on its citizens living abroad.
Cuba announcing new policies that will affect Cuban Americans born on the island nation.
And this all comes as a mass exodus of migrants to the U.S. continues.
For younger Cubans, these new policies are great. It will lower the cost of maintaining a Cuban passport from about $900 to just $180. But for older Cubans, those who arrived here in the U.S. Before 1971, there's a catch. Cuba's foreign ministry announcing major changes for passports. Here's what changed. All Cubans must now possess a Cuban passport to travel to the island. Those who left the country before 1971 no longer exempt. Passports will last for 10 years now instead of 6. The cost of a new passport obtained abroad now lowered from over $400 to just $180. And no longer must passports be validated every 2 years.
This obviously is a step in the right direction.
Former Congressman Joe Garcia says he pushed for these changes, and while he mostly supports the move, he disagrees with the policy that doesn't allow older Cubans to visit the island with a U.S. passport.
But the truth is, even if they didn't have a Cuban passport, the only way they could travel to Cuba was to submit their passport to the Cuban embassy in Washington.
So for older Cubans, the costs of that visa for a one-time visit to Cuba that they used to have to obtain is actually around the same price for a new Cuban passport under these new prices. So financially, there won't be much difference for older Cubans. Of course, politically, some older Cubans are saying they would rather travel to the island with a U.S. passport.
It's a country running on empty. Across Cuba right now, more cars seemingly wait online to fill up than drive on the road. Even at stations when there is no gas, people line up for when or if it finally arrives. For drivers like Elian, the sudden island-wide shortage of fuel means they spend their days trying to fill up rather than working. It ain't easy. They sell too little, he says, only 40 liters. That only gives me enough for one day. They won't give me more than that. Some people immediately siphon the gas they manage to pump, either to resell or to hoard it as they get back in line all over again. Increasingly, Cubans complain that police are letting too many of what they call indisciplinas, undisciplined behavior, take place. What many people do is they save several spots per car, which multiplies many times over how many people are actually in this line waiting for gas. Once the gas actually arrives, though, people come rushing back, they cut the line, and that's when all hell breaks loose. As the lines get longer, tempers get shorter. Certain privileged groups like foreign diplomats have their own gas stations assigned to them, but it makes little difference when there's no gas to pump. The Cuban government has said little about the crisis, the worst in years, but acknowledges that there has been a disruption of shipments from suppliers like Venezuela, Cuba's socialist ally, who they receive oil from in exchange for medical workers.
The first domino piece that falls out of this is Venezuela, that it's selling its better quality crude to those customers that can pay cash. So the good quality crudes that Cuba used to get are no longer there because Cuba doesn't pay cash for crude oil.
The ripple effects of the gas crunch impact nearly everyone on this island. University classes have been canceled. Farmers don't have fuel for tractors. There's not enough diesel for garbage trucks to empty dumpsters that overflow with trash. And the Cuban government was forced to cancel the massive parade held every May Day in Cuba's Revolution Square. Usually, the island's top leadership looks on as hundreds of thousands of workers file by. Cuban officials have said the gas shortages will last at least through the end of May. And as frustrating and punishing as this crisis is for Cubans, all people can do is hope and endure their long wait.
It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's crumbling. Old Havana was founded in 1519 and was once the largest port in the Caribbean. But now many houses are falling apart. Fernando Ramirez Mendoza says the ceiling collapsed just before we arrived.
With the high prices, it's almost impossible to fix the house. I'm retired. The problem is salaries are low and what we earn as pensioners isn't enough, so we can't afford to repair our houses.
Cuba is struggling with a soaring inflation, economic mismanagement, and a U.S. embargo. For years, the government has been trying to restore the old city, and even though it has managed to renovate some historic buildings, the people living here are at constant risk.
The housing situation is particularly dire in Old Havana. Local news reports show that buildings are collapsing quite frequently. In this one where we are right now, that wall that you can see there collapsed in October last year, killing a 5-year-old girl.
Margarita Espinosa's house looks uninhabitable. She says it's an example of what is happening all across the country. She has been asking the government for help for years because she cannot afford to buy food and pay for repairs.
Look at this. Everything is falling apart. Life in Cuba is too difficult these days, but we have to keep going. I was born here and I would like the authorities to fix our house. My mother is in the United States. As soon as I can, I want to leave and go there.
The COVID-19 pandemic devastated the already struggling economy. The government is desperate to attract tourists and has been investing in hotels which bring in foreign currency. One architect says the current problems date back to when Barack Obama was US president, and there were hopes that Cuba would open up.
It's a fundamental mistake. It has to do with state money that's being invested in things that I believe are not priorities. The thinking was that with Obama, things would improve. That didn't happen, and then Trump imposed new sanctions and tourism did not increase. Now they've constructed new buildings, but many people still have nowhere to live.
And people in Old Havana know that all too well. They say their houses are the symbol of an economic system many believed in that has now failed.
So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video to provide you with an update as to what's actually going on in Cuba right now. And what we've seen over the last 6 months is that the economy has gone into a nosedive. The authorities simply don't have enough money to be able to pay for enough fuel and food, and therefore we've got shortages. And as you saw earlier in the video, gasoline stations have run dry, and when they do get supplies in, they are rationed. You are only allowed to buy a maximum of 40 litres. And as we've discussed in previous videos, these fuel shortages are also leading to blackouts, so electricity is having to be cut off because the vast majority of all of the electricity in Cuba is produced using oil, as a result of the fact that the island had a very strong relationship with Russia historically and was receiving large amounts of free oil. But unfortunately for Cuba, that situation ended in 1991 when the Soviet Union broke up. They did manage to strike a deal with Venezuela, which actually has the largest reserves of oil out of any country in the whole world, and is also a communist country and therefore had an affinity with Cuba. But unfortunately, Venezuela went into its own economic crisis after being hit with a raft of US sanctions in 2019. So since that time, Cuba has really struggled to be able to source enough oil to fuel all of its electricity. So the combination of these factors has put immense pressure onto the Cuban economy. And as we've seen in today's video, the sugar industry, which in the past was dominant in terms of the Cuban economy, has gone to rack and ruin. And as a direct result of all of these factors, a lot of people are now leaving Cuba. So the Cuban authorities are in a very difficult and vulnerable situation. And Russia, which is another country that is now facing a wave of sanctions from all of its previous trading partners, has reached out and wants to reinvigorate the once strong relationship between the two countries. And what we've seen in today's video is the Cuban authorities offering Russian investors lots of attractive incentives, and in response to that, the Russian investors have said that they are going to put lots of money into a variety of different industries to get Cuba back onto its feet. However, from a political point of view, this is a hot potato because Cuba is located very close to the USA, less than 100 miles away. And history tells us that the USA does not like a strong relationship between Russia and Cuba. Back in the 1960s, the world came the closest it has ever been to an all-out nuclear war when Russia decided that it was going to install nuclear weapons on the island of Cuba, which resulted in the USA issuing ultimatums, and we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, obviously, the deals that have been announced don't include anything to do with nuclear weapons, so I'm not suggesting that we're going to have another nuclear missile crisis in Cuba. But what we do have is a clear statement from the Cuban authorities that they want to do more business with Russia. And as we discussed earlier in the video, this is really a direct snub to the USA. So we've got a statement of intent here from Cuba. And from Russia's perspective, since the invasion of Ukraine started in February 2022, the country has cut all of its ties with the West and is now looking to build up new trading relations. And the relationship with Cuba doesn't really represent a strong economic advantage to Russia. Russia isn't looking to make lots of profit out of Cuba by selling it large amounts of oil and food. What it's really doing is providing Cuba with all of these things in exchange for debt. These items will be provided on credit, and at some point in the future, Russia will want to be repaid, and it's unlikely that Cuba will have enough cash to be able to do that. So the most likely outcome is that Russia will agree some other form of arrangement, such as taking control of land in Cuba. And that's where problems will start to arise, because if Russia suddenly owns a port or an airport or large areas of land and starts to develop those facilities and then potentially wants to deploy some people onto the island, that could start to raise some very serious security issues and political concerns in the USA. Since the start of the Ukraine war, what we've seen in world politics is a split. And we are starting to see a new East-West divide appearing, and it will be very interesting to see whether or not this split ultimately develops into a new Cold War. What we saw in the 70s and 80s, where we had a clear division and it was the East versus the West. And the re-strengthening of relations between Russia and Cuba could be one of the first steps towards that new Cold War. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments coming out of Cuba. If you've liked what I've said today, if you thought it was interesting, useful and thought-provoking, please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.